Because of what prisoner 819 did, myself a mess, Mr. Correctional Officer. Because of what prisoner 819 did, myself a mess, Mr. Correctional Officer. Because of what
These are not prisoners, and this is not a prison. They are college students, and they were part of an astonishing experiment. On a quiet Sunday morning in August, the Palo Alto police swept through the dorms and student housing areas of Stanford University. The police were told to duplicate every detail of an actual arrest. Much to the surprise of neighbors and onlookers, each student was formally charged with a serious crime and treated as a dangerous criminal.
Okay, you want to get in the car, please, sir? I want to get in the car.
At the police station, students were booked and fingerprinted. Then, each was blindfolded and taken to the basement of the psychology building. There, they were led to a simulated prison block consisting of 3 small cells, a narrow hallway, and a closet designed for solitary confinement. This would be their entire world for 2 weeks. First, the prisoners were stripped and forced to stand naked while they were deloused with a spray. Later, they were given a uniform which was simply a dress with a number on the front. Instead of shaving their heads, the prisoners were given tight stocking caps to cover their hair. They were put in their cells and told to sit in absolute silence. The process of humiliation had begun.
And the prisoners were lined up against the wall for a count. The purpose of the count was to familiarize the prisoners with their numbers and with the numbers of the other prisoners, so that they would begin to think of themselves anonymously as numbers and no longer as people with names and identities.
At first, the guards were still groping for things to do to the prisoners, and the prisoners still weren't sure how to respond.
Well, I don't know. Let's try it together and see if we can get it better from the other end. What do you think?
Let's see if we can count backwards. That might work. Let's see if we can count backwards here.
Let's try that out. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, that's bad. Hey, I don't want anybody left.
On day 2, there was a very sharp change in the whole nature of what was happening in that prison. The prisoners, attempting to assert their freedom, their individuality, rebelled. And we had an open rebellion. What constituted that rebellion? They refused to eat. They barricaded themselves in their cells. They started ripping off their numbers, took off the stocking caps, started screaming out obscenities at the guards, and the guards are frightened.
The guards, not completely certain how to act during this unexpected rebellion, started to remove the beds from one cell. The prisoners were equally uncertain. They still felt the prison was a simulation.
This is unbelievable. They took our clothes.
Hands off the door.
They took our bed.
Hands off the door. Lift your door. Cell 3, don't let him in.
Don't let him in.
Hurry up, Cell 3.
Simulation.
Violation of the rules.
Simulation. It's a simulated experiment. No prison. They'll take your bed and your clothes in prison. They do.
After the rebellion was broken, we then have a count. And now the count suddenly takes on new significance. It began with a simple purpose to familiarize the prisoners with the numbers, and now it evolves into a confrontation. The guards showing the prisoners who's boss. They now taunt, humiliate, degrade the prisoners in front of each other, and they exert arbitrary control over the prisoners.
The guards were not allowed to beat the prisoners, so they fell back on the familiar military technique of ordering push-ups to humiliate them.
You thought that was so funny? You didn't sound it before. No, sir. Did you think it was funny? That was funny. But you didn't smile. Well, get out here and do 5 push-ups. If you didn't smile, you thought it was funny.
The guards didn't plan any of their actions, and the prisoners never knew what was going to happen to them next.
Officer, if we had a try out, sing a voice again tonight. I mean, would you sing something for me? What would you like me to sing, Mr. First Officer? I'd like you to sing numbers 1 through 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Is that singing? 7, 8, 9. Sounds like he's a 4. Is that singing 4, 9, 3? Is that really singing? Like singing to me, Mr. First Officer. Well, you get out here and do 5 push-ups, because I don't think that was singing. Come on, let's go. May I do more, sir? You may do 10 if you'd like. Should I do it until I drop? I didn't ask you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6. You call those 7, 2, 8, 9, 10. Very good. You see how he did that, boy? That was very good, wasn't it? Wasn't it? Yes, sir. Let me hear you. Yes, sir, Mr. Correctional Officer.
By day 3, not only was the rebellion broken, but the guards were exerting control over every aspect of the prisoner's life, telling them when they could go to the toilet, and indeed if they could at all, controlling what they could eat, and even how much, where, and how they should eat.
For lunch, you have a choice of loaf or bologna with lettuce. There's one salami sandwich for whoever wants that, and there will be apples for dessert.
At this point, one of the fascinating things that emerged was the new relationship between prisoners and guards. The guards now fell into their job. Some of them liked it, some of them disliked it, but it was a job that they did. They gave commands, and now what happened is the prisoners followed them, automatically, without questioning, in a servile way. The guards then began to escalate their use of power. Some of them had prisoners clean out toilet bowls with their bare hands, to do things which were really degrading and humiliating, and the prisoners did it without complaining, just did it because this is what they had to do. Things became totally arbitrary. A smile could be rewarded or punished. Whether or not you had a blanket or even a pillow was determined by the arbitrary decision of any one of the guards.
Now this boy here did some good work. He deserves a pillow. 3401 did some nice work. He deserves a pillow. You guys weren't too anxious. Thank you. Now why is it that you took so long to get to work? Do you feel like having a pillow? Well, why should I give you a pillow if you didn't feel like working? Boy, I'll ask you again. Why should I give you a pillow? Because I'm asking you for Mr. Kirkland. But you didn't get around to work until about 10 minutes after everyone else did. Let's see in the future that you do work when you're told.
And thinking real sweetly. I sure have that sounded very nasty.
Say it again.
Thank you, Mr. Kirkland.
Say bless you, correction officer.
Bless you, Mr. Kirkland.
Now remember, only 4 days had passed. They were in this prison only 4 days, but that was enough, because their sense of time had been totally altered, and indeed their sense of moral value. So much so that when a prisoner got sick, 819, and before releasing him, I put him in a room to rest, the guard seized this as an opportunity to set the prisoners against each other, and had the prisoners chant loud enough so that this poor 819 could hear this, that he was a bad prisoner. I raced into the room once I realized that he could hear this. What I found was a boy crying hysterically, bawling, while in the background his fellows, his other students just like him, were yelling that he was a bad prisoner, that they were being punished because of him.
Prisoner 819 is being punished, Mr. Correctional Officer. Prisoner 819 is being punished, Mr. Correctional Officer. Prisoner 819 is being punished, Mr. Correctional Officer. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Prisoner 819 did a bad thing. Because of what prisoner 819 did, myself is a mess. Because of what prisoner 819 did, myself is a mess. Because of what prisoner 819 did, myself is a mess.
Imagine how he felt. I said, let's leave, and I had already told him the experiment was over for him. He said, no, I can't leave. He couldn't leave feeling he was a bad prisoner.
As a result of prisoner 819's behavior, all the others were forced by the guards to do mass push-ups.
Down. Up. Down. Up.
Thank you very much for this nice count, Mr. Correctional Officer.
By the 5th day, things had gotten so bad that we no longer had a group of prisoners. What we had were individuals believing they were prisoners, struggling for individual survival, no longer caring about their other prisoners or their other fellow students. This really hit home when we observed one of the prisoners, 416, make a last futile attempt to assert his individuality and freedom. He refused to eat. The guards could not get him to eat. So here was a chance for the prisoners to reorganize, to solidify a new act of rebellion. What did they do? They isolated him. The prisoners didn't want to have anything to do with him because he was a bad prisoner. The guards did everything they could. They tried to force feed him. They tried to get the other prisoners to do it. They threatened to cut off visiting hours for the other prisoners if he wouldn't eat. Still, that had no effect. They then took him and put him in a hole, solitary confinement, a small closet, 2 feet by 4 feet, dark, with stench air. He still refused. At this point, he should have been a hero to the other prisoners. Instead, he became a source of trouble.
Come on. Get in that closet then.
That's prisoner 416 on the floor, as he was forced into solitary.
You got a nice friend. Even here, we're going to see to it that you don't get blankets tonight.
Because of his refusal to eat, the prisoners were lined up for yet another count. But this time, the guards allowed them to express their anger directly at prisoner 416.
Thank you, 416.
Okay, 209.
Thank you, 416.
Over there. Oh, that's right.
What did you say?
Oh, yeah, you do it the same way, 209.
Thank you, 416.
Okay, that's enough. I had enough you have.
Finally, what happened is the guards gave the prisoners a choice. They could have this poor guy come out of solitary if they were willing to give up some little thing, their blanket. It wasn't even very cold in the cells. However, if they wanted their own blanket, then he would have to stay in solitary. The prisoners voted, and they voted to take their own blankets and let him rot in solitary.
Now, there's a couple ways that we can do this, depending upon what you want to do. Now, if 416 does not want to eat his sausages, then you can give me the blankets and sleep on the bare mattress, or you can keep your blankets and 416 will stay in another day. Now, what will it be? What will it be over here? How about 5486?
I'll give you my blanket, Mr. Corporal Officer. You don't want his blanket.
Well, now you boys got to come to some kind of decision here.
Well, you two, Master, how do you feel about this? We got 3 in favor of keeping the blanket.
We got 3 against 1. Keep your blanket. 416, you're going to be in there for a while. So just get used to it.
At this point, we had to end the experiment. We had to end the experiment because it no longer was an experiment. We had created a prison in which people were suffering, in which the prisoners were passive, withdrawn, isolated, detached, behaving in pathological ways. Some of the guards were behaving sadistically, brutally, and many of the guards who were not were helpless to do anything about it, indeed allowed it to go on, never countermanded an order, just were helpless and drawn into this thing. And at that point, we said, enough, we have to end this.
I had really thought that I was incapable of this kind of behavior. I was surprised, even no, I was dismayed to find out that I could really be that I could act in a manner so absolutely unaccustomed to anything I would even really dream of doing. And while I was doing it, I didn't feel any regret. I didn't feel any guilt. It was only afterwards when I began to reflect on what I had done that this behavior began to dawn on me, and I realized that this was a part of me I hadn't really noticed before.
I began to feel that I was losing my identity, that the person that I called Clay, the person who put me in this place, the person who volunteered to go into this prison, because it was a prison to me, it still is a prison to me. I don't look on it as an experiment or a simulation. It was just a prison that was run by psychologists instead of run by the state. I began to feel that identity, that the person that I was that had decided to go to prison was distant from me, was remote, until finally I wasn't that. I was 416. I was really my number, and 416 was going to have to decide what to do.
Once you put a uniform on and are given a role, I mean a job, saying your job is to keep these people in line, then you're certainly not the same person as if you were in street clothes and in a different role. You really become that person once you put on that khaki uniform, you put on the glasses, you take the nightstick, and you act the part. That's your costume, and you have to act accordingly when you put it on.
It harms me. Why? I mean harms. I mean in the present tense, it harms me.
How did it harm you? How does it harm you? Just to think about it? You mean that people can be like that?
Yeah. It let me in on some knowledge that I've never experienced firsthand. I've read about it. I've read a lot about it, but I've never experienced it firsthand. I've never seen someone turn that way. And I know you're a nice guy. You know?
You don't
you
know
understand?
That,
I do. I do know you're a nice guy.
Then why,
I don't get
me?
that because I know what you can turn into. I know what you're willing to do. If you say, oh, well, I'm not going to hurt anybody. Oh, well, it's a limited situation. It's over in 2 weeks.
Well, you in position, what would you have done?
I don't know. I can't tell you, but I know what I'd do.
Would you believe?
I don't believe I would have been as inventive as you.
You mean
I don't believe I would have applied as much imagination to what I was doing. Do you understand?
Yes, I understand.
I think I would have been a guard. I don't think it would have been such a masterpiece.
I didn't see where it was really harmful. It was degrading, and that was part of my particular little experiment to see how I could...
Your particular little experiment.
Yes,
Why don't you tell me about that?
I was running little experiments of my own.
Tell me about your little experiments.
Okay.
I'm curious.
I wanted to see just what kind of verbal abuse that people can take before they start objecting, before they start flashing back.
Yeah.
Under the circumstances. And it surprised me that no one said anything to stop me. No one said, Carmen, you can't say those things to me. Those things are sick. Nobody said that. They just accepted what I said. I said, go tell that man to the face he's the scum of the earth, and they'd do it without question. They'd do push-ups without question. They'd sit in the hole. They'd abuse each other. And here they're supposed to have they're supposed to be together as a unit in jail, but here they're abusing each other because I requested them to. And no one questioned my authority at all. And it really shocked me. Why didn't people, when I started to abuse people so much, I started to get so profane that, and still people didn't say anything.